For over 4 decades, every American president has pledged energy independence. It was supposed to strengthen us geopolitically, make us more secure, and boost our economy.
The United States will not be dependent on any other country for the energy we need.
This nation will never use more foreign oil.
America must get to work producing more energy.
No security for the United States in further dependence on foreign oil.
To replace more than 75% of our oil imports.
We've talked and talked about the need to end America's century-long addiction to fossil fuels.
Now, for the first time in 65 years, we are a net exporter of energy.
Well, not quite yet, but it's close. By 2020, for the first time since 1953, the United States is predicted to become a net energy exporter, meaning it will export more fossil fuels than it imports.
What has happened in the U.S. shale oil industry, it's never happened on this scale or this fast anywhere in the history of oil before.
People will tell you that it's been a big deal, but actually they're way understating what an enormous deal this has been for the U.S.
Our status as the world's largest producer of oil, and this whole belief in the Shale Revolution is leading to American energy independence, depends on an ongoing influx of capital. It's kind of a Ponzi scheme.
For almost a century, America was the largest oil producer in the world. So how did we get hooked on foreign oil? Before we go any further, it's important to understand what energy sources are available and how they're consumed. The 2 major energy sources in the U.S. are petroleum, including crude oil and refined products, and natural gas. The 2 make up nearly 2/3 of our total consumption. Coal and nuclear power's role, that's diminishing, and renewable energies like solar and wind, they're growing. But together, there's still a small segment of our energy consumption, making up only the remaining third. So how is it used? 92% of petroleum is used for transportation. The majority of natural gas is used to heat our homes, generate electric power, and fuel our industries. The story of American oil begins in 1859 in Titusville, Pennsylvania. Small amounts of oil had seeped from the ground for a long time, but no one knew how to extract it. Until Edwin Laurentin Drake, a former conductor, was hired. After many failed attempts, he finally struck gold, black gold. So over the next couple of decades, major oil finds in Texas, California, and Oklahoma contributed to U.S. emergence as a major economic power. The 1901 Spindletop gusher in Texas nearly tripled U.S. oil production. Henry Ford's Model T invention in 1908, the first mass-produced car, made America the most motorized country in the world. Other industrialized countries like France, Britain, and Germany were ways behind.
It was World War I that turned oil into a strategic commodity, because a war that began with people riding horses ended with airplanes, tanks, trucks, and motorcycles.
In 1919, the U.S. Geological Survey estimated that the U.S. would run out of oil within 10 years.
The great Texas oil industry has a hard-fisted history of company feuds and...
But that fear was short-lived. Regulatory changes and technological breakthroughs doubled U.S. production. And that wasn't the last time the oil industry defied the odds. By World War II, America was responsible for 60% of world production. 6 out of every 7 barrels used by Great Britain, China, Soviet Union, and the rest of the Allied forces came from the U.S.
Conclusion to the historic Yalta Conference.
In February 1945, on his way home from the Yalta Conference, President Franklin Roosevelt met with Saudi King Ibn Saud for the first time.
Then representing Saudi Arabia comes King Ibn Saud. This conference was no doubt among the most important of these meetings, and presumably centered on the vastly important question of oil.
And the reason for that meeting was a recognition that major new oil reserves had been discovered in Saudi Arabia, and particularly coming out of the experience of the war, a sense that the United States needed to develop a relationship with this nation, Saudi Arabia, with which there had really been no connection before. Roosevelt had 2 wheelchairs with him. He was paralyzed from polio, and King Ibn Saud's legs were giving out. So Roosevelt actually gave King Ibn Saud one of his wheelchairs. Coming out of World War II, demand in the U.S. started to really take off with the building of suburbs, with motor cars and so forth. And it was right after World War II that the United States moved into this position of being an importer of oil rather than the world's most important exporter.
The economy was booming in America after the war, and consumption of oil and natural gas grew with it. In the 50s and the 60s, a massive pipeline network for natural gas was built throughout the United States. But for oil, worries about hitting a peak in production were spreading. Fueling the uncertainty, King Hubbard, geophysicist at Shell, predicted that the U.S. would run out of oil by 1970.
You know, you'd set up the economy over the previous 70, 80 years to use a lot of oil because U.S. had been the #1 producer in the world. You had abundant U.S. oil to use, and nobody had really thought about alternatives or efficiency. It was in many ways just a given that you had cheap, available U.S. oil.
In 1960, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela formed the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries, or OPEC.
When OPEC was formed, hardly anybody noticed. What had happened in the late 1960s, there was really a glut, a surplus of oil, and the oil industry cut the price, and they cut it not once, but twice, and that's when oil was very cheap, $1 or $2 a barrel. And that really reduced the revenues of the oil-producing countries. And a few of them got together, led by Saudi Arabia and Venezuela, and formed this organization called OPEC.
Within a decade, member countries nationalized their petroleum industries, brought in massive revenue, and became an increasingly dominant force in the world. Together, they represented 80% of the world's crude exports.
The Israelis broke through and later in the day reached
the 1973 Arab-Israeli war led to an oil embargo by OPEC.
It was not until the Mideast oil embargo in the fall of 1970...
Member countries put a sudden halt on oil exports to the U.S., and that caused a frenzy.
Gasoline stations ran dry. Airlines cut back flight schedules. Factories were forced to close.
Prices exploded from $3 to nearly $12 a barrel in 3 months. That's $72 a barrel in today's dollars. The U.S. dependence on foreign oil was a reality.
That created really the crisis and panic in the world oil market. It led to gas lines in the United States, it led to prices shooting up, and it led to a huge political battle within the United States. And part of the response...
President Nixon told the country of Project Independence, the plan to make the United States entirely independent of foreign sources of energy by the end of this decade.
Was President Nixon declaring what he called Project Independence, which was this theme that the U.S. would somehow become energy independent again, as it once had been.
Our own energy needs without depending on any foreign enemy.
A lot of programs were launched, big programs. A lot of regulations were put into effect, for instance, automobile fuel efficiency standards. But basically, the U.S. seemed destined to just continue to import more oil, and that's mostly what happened in the decades that followed.
Congress mandated a speed limit on highways and passed the Energy Policy and Conservation Act of 1975. It led to greater fuel efficiency and developments in renewables. The late 70s and 80s were overrun by turmoil and pervasive anxiety. At home, the fear over peak oil was everywhere. At the same time, consumption of natural gas was growing faster than production. From 1986 to 2000, net imports as a share of natural gas consumption quadrupled. By the early 2000s, the question became less about who was going to supply the ever-increasing U.S. appetite for fossil fuels and more about new consumer markets.
Suddenly, China emerged from communism, had a very rapidly growing economy and had a very rapid oil demand growth, and that essentially began to exceed the ability of the global oil system to supply enough oil. And of course, what happens if you've got too much demand and not enough supply is the price got driven very, very high for oil. We went in 2008 to $150 a barrel. price today is about 60 to 70. So if you think about it, oil prices were double at that time, and it caused a major issue that ultimately became part of the global financial crisis that occurred in 2009.
It was during this time a group of risk-taking entrepreneurs saw an opportunity.
In particular, a man named George Mitchell in Texas, who for about a decade and a half had his company seen, is there some way to get, initially it was to get gas, not oil, out of shale rock.
What had happened is the oil that flows easily had been produced, and you were left with the oil that's trapped in very tight formations, and there needed to be discovered a way to produce that oil.
They combined two existing technologies. First is horizontal drilling, essentially drilling straight down and then turning at an angle to target part of the shale formation. The second is hydraulic fracturing, or fracking. This involves pumping water, sand, and chemicals at high pressure into shale formations to fracture the rock, allowing oil and gas trapped inside to flow.
Suddenly the U.S., instead of being short of gas, was actually starting to have a lot of gas. And indeed, the question was starting to become, is the U.S. going to be not an importer of natural gas, but an exporter? And then it got applied to oil, and the impact has been enormous. And I would say that the impact has also been an enormous surprise.
From 2007 to 2017, natural gas production increased by more than 40%, and prices dropped from $9 to $2.50 per BTU. Meanwhile, crude oil production went from 5 to over 9 million barrels a day. The U.S. dropped its imports of crude by more than 30%. For the first time in decades, energy independence was a possibility.
Seriously, but still kind of jokingly, there aren't many places in the United States that you can't drill a well and not find natural gas.
What came next? We'll take a look at the Shale Revolution in another video.
I felt wonderful. I mean, they sold it as the new Saudi Arabia of the United States, Western Pennsylvania.
And we'll explain how big oil companies missed out on a huge opportunity.
The fact that things have changed so dramatically in a decade is a testament to the power of this thing called the Shale Revolution. I just question how sustainable it is.
It was almost industrial waste, if not hazardous waste. It's a shame that it had to come down to us doing it. We were preferring that a state agency would have done that, or when we asked for help, maybe somebody would have looked into it a little bit better.